Thank you for the lovely introduction. Hi everyone, magandang umaga, good morning from Quezon City in Metro Manila, Philippines. I'm super excited to be here today to talk a little bit about and share my experiences about organizing alongside youth communities, starting as a youth activist myself, not only in the Philippines but in Asia. So as mentioned, I'm a writer and a climate organizer. I organize, my day job organizing is with 350.org Asia team. But I have the pleasure and I have the honor of organizing meeting communities and local youth organizations who are tackling the climate crisis in a myriad of different ways. So my sharing today is about organizing for climate justice, going beyond calls for action, calls for awareness, but organizing specifically for climate justice in order to build the world that we deserve. So why climate justice, right? It's climate action is something that everyone is calling for. We have world leaders, we have celebrities, we have influencers, we have our friends, families. They all understand us work as merely calling for climate action, for people to take action on climate change. But climate change is not just a strictly technical environmental issue concerning polar bears or melting ice caps or complicated statistics and studies on rising temperatures all over the world. And while all that science background is important, we have to emphasize that the missing component in climate change discourse is people. And we, coming from Asia, coming from a lot of vulnerable countries in the region, we know that this is our story as well. It's not just a science textbook story, but climate change is a story of our people. I won't go into this so much, but climate change has deep repercussions, as we know, on our human rights, on our health, on conflict, migration, displacement, gender-based violence, and many more. You can talk to, for example, a frontline community whose human rights are threatened by polluting companies. You can talk to members of the LGBTQ and women and children who are more vulnerable when disaster hits in evacuation centers. There is no climate justice without gender justice, without economic justice, without gender justice, without labor justice, because all these issues are interrelated, and climate justice organizing, going beyond climate action and calls for adaptation, is ultimately intersectional. Fighting for climate justice, and I think any young person deciding to fight, to take climate action, will inevitably arrive at the conclusion that climate justice is interrelated with other injustices in the world, and both fighting the injustices wrought and exacerbated by climate change means standing up for the most vulnerable, the most affected communities. Those who are least responsible for climate change, as any other global issue, are also the ones experiencing its worst impacts. Those who cause climate change are anything but held accountable, and the roots and impacts both exacerbate structural inequalities. And whenever I get asked by my friends, for example, or my family, why I'm fighting specifically for climate justice when there's a lot of other issues that I can busy myself with. For example, I can just be, I can fight for gender justice. I can fight for the rights of people without shelter, the rights of the LGBTQ community. I always say that climate justice brings all of those issues in because they are interrelated, and the climate fight is intersectional. So how do you address that, right? Going through one issue alone is already super complicated, super overwhelming, sometimes disheartening, sometimes disillusioning. But why must we tackle climate justice and its host of other issues? I believe that the way to do it, and in my role, I'm very fortunate to contribute even just a tiny bit into building people power, with the understanding that climate justice and genuine adaptation, mitigation, genuine climate solutions will come from the ground up. Adapting to the climate impacts and adapting to the issue of climate change means acknowledging that loss and damage is happening. We are losing not just our shelter or livelihood, economic losses like that, but also non-economic losses like our culture, our heritage, our mental well-being. Adapting to climate impacts means acknowledging the very different ways that we are impacted, as well as the trauma our people and youth go through on a daily basis as we confront this problem. In Asia, there are many different ways that young people are rising up. And my favorite part about my job or my role or my organizing is the fact that I get to witness a lot of fellow youth hosting their own campaigns on what climate justice means for them. So for example, there are of course people who work with governments in crafting climate adaptation plans, and they're inputting into national strategies, and that's beautiful. But there's also lesser heard campaigns such as grassroots campaigns for climate justice, calling for climate emergency declarations, calling for governments to divest from fossil fuels, calling for polluters to be held accountable. For example, in the Philippines, there's a case here calling on how carbon majors can be held liable for human rights damages. And there are also cross-regional campaigns. I think we have a speaker here later who can talk about the work between Fridays for Future Japan and Bangladesh, how they're working towards divesting the money from a Japanese bank going through a coal plant in Bangladesh. There's also campaigns for a Green New Deal, and this is all happening from Philippines to Japan, Malaysia to Bangladesh, and many more places. The key here really is to think of ourselves not as separate fights, but as interlinked struggles that we can push through for climate justice in solidarity with each other. And I'd like to end with this image that was taken in 1990. If you can see the blue dot there, that's actually Earth. And this is the reason why I'm always very much speaking about solidarity and the importance of thinking of our fight as interrelated and as one fight, even if it's local components, even if we have different social political contexts. We are living in that pale blue dot, the only home we've ever known. So that's here, that's home, that's us. There's no better demonstration of the folly of human conceits than this distant image of tiny world. As Carl Sagan wrote, it underscores our responsibility to deal more kindly with one another and to preserve and cherish the pale blue dot, the only home we've ever known. And global solidarity is key in our own organizing, in our projects and activism, whether that we are focusing on mitigation, on adaptation, whether we're focusing on calling for reforms in policies, or whether we're lobbying our leaders to craft just transition policy packages, whatever shape or form our fights take, global solidarity is very important. And if you connect with me after this, I can connect you to other Asian orgs also working on this exact thing and in a million of different things that contributes not only to climate adaptation and addressing the impacts of climate change, but also to upholding climate justice. So yeah, this is my information. If anyone's interested to connect later, thank you all. Thank you for having me.